In early December 2025, the White House staged what looked like a classic rescue moment. Standing in the Oval Office, President Donald Trump announced a $12 billion emergency relief package for struggling American farmers, declaring that Washington would not allow U.S. agriculture to collapse under financial pressure. But while the cameras were rolling and the headlines focused on the bailout, something else was happening behind the scenes, something far more dangerous. At the very same time he was promising to save farmers, Trump was threatening to cripple the one supply chain they cannot live without: fertilizer, specifically Canadian potash. It was a contradiction so extreme that economists, farm groups, and even Republican lawmakers were stunned. Trump was effectively pouring water on a fire with one hand while lighting it with the other, and the consequences of that contradiction are now spreading across America's food system. This is the story of how a trade war over fertilizer quietly became one of the most destabilizing economic events of Trump's second term. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what potash really is. Potash is not just another industrial product. It is the backbone of modern agriculture. Every major U.S. crop, corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, cotton, depends on potassium-based fertilizer to grow at commercial scale. Without it, yields collapse, plants become weaker, soil productivity drops. You cannot substitute potash with innovation, software, or automation. It comes from the ground, and it comes from very specific places. That's where America's vulnerability begins. The United States imports about 90% of the potash it uses, and of that imported supply, roughly 80 to 87% comes from one place: Saskatchewan, Canada. That means one Canadian province provides the overwhelming majority of the fertilizer that keeps America's farms alive. There is no meaningful stockpile. There is no rapid alternative. There is no backup supplier waiting in the wings. If Canadian potash is disrupted, U.S. agriculture feels it almost immediately. This is not theoretical. This is a structural dependency built over decades. And in 2025, Trump decided to target it. In March 2025, as part of his broader push for economic nationalism, President Trump imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian potash. The goal, he said, was to protect American industry. But there was a problem. There is no American potash industry capable of replacing Canadian supply. The tariff did not protect U.S. producers. It punished U.S. farmers. Within days, agricultural organizations began sounding the alarm. Fertilizer already makes up 30 to 45% of total farm operating costs depending on the crop. Raising that cost by 25% overnight is catastrophic. For large corn and soybean farms, fertilizer expenses can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. The tariff erased profit margins instantly, and farmers could not pass those costs on to buyers. Crop prices are set globally. Farmers are price takers. They absorb the hit or go under. By the end of 2025, the damage was measurable. The U.S. import price index for chemical fertilizers jumped from 164.5 inches late 2024 to 186.5 by September 2025, a surge of more than 13% in less than a year. Fertilizer became the single biggest driver of rising farm input costs. Farmers saw their expenses climb even as crop prices remained under pressure. The result was a wave of financial stress across rural America. Supporters of Trump's tariff argued that higher prices would encourage domestic production. That sounds logical until you look at the geology. Potash is not manufactured. It is mined. And Canada won the Geological lottery. Saskatchewan sits on more than 1 billion tons of recoverable potash reserves, one of the largest deposits on Earth. The United States, by comparison, has only a fraction of that. In 2024, Canada produced more than 30 times as much potash as the U.S. That is not a market imbalance. That is a geological reality, and it cannot be fixed quickly. Even if the United States decided to go all in on potash mining, the timeline is brutal. A new potash mine takes 10 to 15 years to go from planning to full production. It requires billions of dollars. It carries huge geological and financial risk. And it only becomes profitable if global prices stay high. The U.S. government has already tried to jumpstart domestic production. A massive potash project in Michigan received more than $1 billion in federal loan guarantees and hundreds of millions more in state support. Even with that, it will not begin producing for years. And when it does, it will still replace less than half of what America currently imports from Canada. Meanwhile, Canada is expanding even faster. One of the world's largest mining companies, BHP, is building a gigantic new potash mine in Saskatchewan. When it comes online, it will add millions of tons per year to global supply. By the time U.S. mines are ready, Canada will have expanded production so much that American producers will struggle to compete unless Washington permanently subsidizes them. In other words, Trump's tariffs do not make America stronger. They make it more dependent on government aid. When the 25% tariff hit, farmers revolted. Spring planting season was approaching. That is when fertilizer purchases are locked in for the entire year. Budgets were destroyed overnight. The American Soybean Association warned that 2025 would be the third straight year of losses for many growers. Even Trump allies in Congress spoke out. Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley publicly urged the president to exempt potash from tariffs entirely. Farm lobbies flooded Washington with warnings. Under intense pressure, Trump cut the tariff from 25% to 10%. But by then, the damage was already baked into prices. Markets do not reset easily. Once costs rise, they tend to stay elevated. In December 2025, Trump announced a $12 billion emergency aid package for farmers. Total government payments to agriculture for the year are expected to approach $40 billion. That is near record territory. This is not economic strength. It is crisis management. Taxpayers are now subsidizing the consequences of a policy that never needed to exist. Here is where the story becomes truly dangerous. If American farmers cannot afford Canadian potash, they have only one realistic alternative: Russia. Russia and its ally Belarus control more than a third of the world's potash supply. They have the mines, they have the export infrastructure, and they desperately need cash to fund Russia's war machine. By making Canadian fertilizer more expensive, Trump has created a scenario where American agriculture could end up financially supporting the same country the U.S. is trying to weaken. That is not just bad economics. That is a national security failure. Canada saw this coming. For years, Canadian potash producers have been reducing their reliance on the U.S. market and expanding sales to Brazil, China, and Southeast Asia. Trump's tariff threats accelerated that shift. Canadian companies are building new export routes and locking in long-term contracts overseas. The more Washington weaponizes trade, the less leverage America has. As of early 2026, the potash tariff issue is unresolved. Farmers are heading into another planting season with uncertainty hanging over their budgets. Uncertainty reduces investment. It reduces planting. It reduces fertilizer use. It reduces yields. And that eventually shows up in grocery store prices. This crisis exposes a truth Trump refuses to accept. You cannot tariff your way out of geological reality. America does not have the potash. Canada does. And trying to fight that with nationalism only makes U.S. farmers weaker. For decades, Canada and the United States built a stable fertilizer partnership that benefited both sides. Trump shattered it for political optics. And now American agriculture is paying the price.